I'm going to introduce folks in just a second, or actually have them introduce each other, but just a couple of introductory words, and we're so grateful that you chose to join us today. Thank you for being a part of this workshop. 2025, let's think back for a moment. 2025 began with the costliest wildfires in American history. We remember the series of blazes that scorched LA for nearly all of January. Other catastrophes followed: severe storms across the southern and northeastern United States, tornadoes in the central states, drought and heat waves throughout the West. All told, the United States tallied $23 billion weather and climate disasters last year. 23 of them were billion-dollar disasters, which claimed 276 lives and caused $115 billion in damage. Only 2023 and 2024 recorded more of these events, and 2025 was the 15th consecutive year with an above-average number. Some of you are wondering, why not 2025? Why was it down? Because we didn't have a hurricane hit in 25. In addition to the devastating toll on human life, a recent University of Chicago study predicts that climate-related disasters could potentially cause more than $1 trillion in damages between now and 2030 in our country alone. The high probability highlights the importance of continuing to track disasters and to invest in resilience and preparedness. The National Resources Defense Council says that while national action to mitigate climate disasters is crucial, local communities don't have to wait to begin protecting themselves now. Because when extreme conditions come on suddenly, what can matter most is what we've already built, whether in the form of shared spaces or how we show up for one another. A neighbor checks in during a blackout. A gardening club plants trees along a sun-scorched block. A local business opens its doors as a cooling shelter. Resilience is not a single fix, the NRDC says. It's a system of shared care built by people who want to help our communities survive the known and unknown challenges of a warming world. Our panel today aims to deepen our understanding of resilience, to share insights around planning and organizing, and to encourage us to consider what action we might take in our communities. I'm honored to be joined up here by Dr. Jennifer Hirsch, Dr. Ayika Holloman Hill, and Hannah Schulz. And I'm gonna let them introduce themselves with what they want you to know about them. And I'm also gonna ask them to comment a little bit about what your thoughts on resilience, sort of how that landed for them. I'm glad y'all are here. I'm glad you're at UUCA. Thank you for being a part of the Soul Summit. So why don't we start? I was like, I hope I didn't do that. Start with you, and if you will, introduce yourself, and then any impressions of the word cloud.
Back to the word cloud for him?
Can I? Let's see.
Sure. I'm Jennifer. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Jennifer Hirsch, and I live not too far from here at kind of the border of Decatur and Avondale. I'm originally a Chicagoan. But I've been here. Are you a Chicagoan?
Well, I lived in Illinois.
That always raises hands because we appreciate each other in that city. Been here about 10 years. I'm an applied cultural anthropologist, and I do a lot of work around climate and environment with a very strong focus on community leadership and environmental and social justice. And I run a center at Georgia Tech that's called the Center for Sustainable Communities Research and Education, or SCORE, and we do a lot of work around community-led resilience. So I'm supposed to comment on this. One of the things that I think it's unusual to see something like faith in action. I think that caught both of our attention. How do we take ideas about resilience and what does it really look like to act on them? And I love some of the stuff that gets at things like joy and humor and kind of the human side of getting through what are sometimes the hardest things in people's lives. And then I also love what you just said, which is that resilience is a system of shared care. And I think that's something we'll probably talk about a lot.
I have my own. Yes. Good morning. It's still morning, yes. My name is Ayika Holloman Hill, affectionately known in the community as Dr. E. By academic training, I'm a marine scientist. Actually, received my degree from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science back in 2012. I currently run a family-owned and operated environmental consulting firm. But right now, I'm thinking about my 4 boys who are home, so I'm a mother first in this space. I'm a mother of 4 young boys here. I'm born and raised in Atlanta, so I'm a true ATLian. They do exist. We are here. And I am currently a member of Community Church Atlanta. We are the first community-owned resilient hub to open up in the state of Georgia with some help from some partners like Groundswell and others. And so today I'm really excited to share my personal perspective of being a member and helping the church, but also from a academic in the work around resilience, which has been some of my work for the last 5 years.
Maybe impression.
Yes, similar to what Jenny said, the faith in action, endurance, flexibility is something that is critical during times of needs, and to be able to also have that joy and humor, to your point again, I think is the small things that we don't think about, but are very critical in helping us make it through in what we like to call the recovery phase and what that looks like. And sometimes you have to hold on to things that may not be fully present right there, but will sustain in the future.
Hey everyone, I'm Hannah Schulz. I'm the program director at Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. We're an environmental faith-based nonprofit. We work here in Georgia to organize communities of faith across the state to help them establish green teams and congregations to implement practical climate solutions on site. And then we do a lot of policy and advocacy work as well at the federal, local, and state level. So yeah, really excited to be here with you all today. One of our newest programs at GIPL is our Resilience Hub program. So we're working to help faith communities think about what it would look like to be a resilience hub to kind of respond to community needs in that way. I'm originally from Baltimore, so not an Atlanta native. I've also been here for about 10 years. I'm my Master of Divinity from Candler School of Theology at Emory, so a theologian by training. And yeah, really excited to be applying that to environmental work. I think one of the things that stands out to me about this word cloud is actually what's not on the word cloud. I was at a resilience conference a couple weeks ago, and we did an activity like this. And one of the biggest words on the screen was bounce back. And I kind of love that that's not on the screen right now, because to me, resilience is not about bouncing back to how things were before. It's really about how communities adapt and thrive and move forward to being even better than they were before. We don't want to go back to the conditions that we were in. It's about how you adapt and move ahead. So that's what kind of stood out to me about what you all came up with.
Thank you. Good panelists. The right panelists for us today, right? Yeah. So let's start with a simple question. Maybe not so simple. In your opinion, what are some of the most common perceptions or misperceptions about building resilience?
I'm happy to get us started with this one. I think one of the misperceptions is that you have to have a lot of money or start something new to build resilience in your community. I think a lot of times, at least in the spaces that I work in, when we talk about resilience, is often getting solar and battery storage in order to be able to keep lights on in your building. And while that is a really important part and a piece of what resilient infrastructure could look like, it is also about building out programs and services and opportunities to better the community. And a lot of times it's expanding on ministries that already exist in congregations. So you don't have to have a lot of money, you don't have to build something new, For example, if your congregation has a food pantry that already exists, resilience is really thinking about how you take that food pantry and in a time of disaster, how are you distributing food to the community? How are you putting in some shelving so that you can expand food storage so that you have extra supplies on hand? So you don't have to be reinventing the wheel or starting with something new. You can start with expanding on things that you already have.
Yeah, I agree 100% with you, Hannah, in terms of the tech. When we oftentimes talk about resilient hubs, people go straight to the PV, the solar, and the battery storage versus the people. And it's going back to what you said, the shared caring and understanding that we are already either a part of or creating resilient networks just through the work of the church or through the work of the faith-based organizations already. And so having to take some time to step back and look inward in terms of what is it that you're already doing that could be then supported by the tech. But at the end, it really, even though you may have the tech, if you still don't have the people, the nice people, the caring people, as we say, welcome home at community church in terms of during disasters, being able to have that cheerful countenance about yourself becomes a part of the puzzle that's glazed over too often, straight to the shiny solar and battery storage. And I'd like to suggest for you all to really take a step inward and think about where the spaces that you are already part of a resilient network or already doing things that support community in this way.
Please. I'm asking, she was asking, do we need to all answer? And I think ultimately there are a lot of perceptions, and the more we here at UUCA are starting to understand the concept, it's broadening and deepening at both times. So I am curious from your perspective, sort of, as maybe especially misperceptions that people may have.
I'm thinking about, I agree with everything that you both said. I think another misperception is thinking about which populations have demonstrated the most resilience. And I think oftentimes it goes back to perceptions of money. The idea that if you're really wealthy, then you are the most resilient. Which, there are times when that is true. If you live closer to the levees or further from the levees, if you live where there's better infrastructure or worse infrastructure, that's going to make you more or less resilient to some things. But I think, if you think about who are the most resilient people in your lives, you don't tend to think about storms, or you tend to think about emotional resilience and some of the words that were up there, yeah. And so I think sometimes we think that, the wealthier communities have to go teach the communities that have less money how to be resilient. And it's like, many of those people, if you have grown up in communities that have been marginalized and under-resourced, those are some of the most resilient communities in the history of the world, right? I think the fact that African Americans still exist in this country after what has happened, or you see what's happening right now with ICE, and you think about the resilience of our immigrant communities, or what these immigrants, some of them, the ones who've gotten asylum, and what they have gone through to get to this country, is the very definition of resilience. So when we think about who do we learn, how do we learn, and who do we learn from what resilience really looks like, where are the models out there, I think sometimes we need to think more about the people than the tech, as you said. There's maybe one quick story that I'll tell that is kind of similar. Well, I liked your food pantry example, but many years ago when there was the big tsunami in Japan, we're going back 15 years ago now, and they thought all those communities on the coast had been destroyed. It took some of the disaster responders, emergency responders, days to get to this little fishing hamlet. There was an article about this in the New York Times, is where I learned about it. And when they got there, the fishing hamlet, everybody was alive. They had all moved to higher ground right before the tsunami had come, and they were all functioning and taking care of each other. And when they asked them, like, how did this happen? What they said, which I think is particularly relevant to this audience, is that they had had a regular festival every year for as long as anybody could remember, and that they knew how to work together. And that because of that, the people who understood what was happening were able to get in touch with the other people, and they had all of their stuff organized in a big warehouse, and they had systems for getting it out to people, and it saved their entire community. And had nothing to do with technology.
Nothing to do with tech, yeah.
Thank you. I think I, like many, came into the conversations around resilience thinking about facilities and thinking about, moments of disaster striking and cooling centers and power outages and all that. And I think I was coming from a very tech place. And I know that still dominates a lot of the circles of this topic. So it's good to be reminded that they're very important, but they're not necessarily physical structures. They are relational structures, just like you said. So I'm curious how all of you found your way into the resilience area and this arena, and how your organizations maybe found your way, you and or your organizations moving into this space.
I'll start. So again, I run an environmental consulting firm, and at the core of what we do is kind of translate science from communities to municipal government, larger nonprofits, or vice versa. And I'll just give you an example. My family is from Dalton, Georgia, carpet capital of the world at one point. My mother would tell a story about playing in Rainbow Creek. As I got more informed about the Rainbow Creek, I was able to translate to her the endocrine disruptors, the dyes, and the issues that may have caused her cancer, all right? Or another example is my grandmother talking about all the air. I also have family in Brunswick, so if you've ever traveled down to South Brunswick, there's a stench that kind of permeates due to the pulp mill industry. And, a lot of the elders are talking about the air is killing me. And that falls on deaf ears, especially with a lot of politics around that. But when you speak the language of you've exceeded the EPA's rule of 2.5 p.m., it triggers something different. And so at the core of what we do, we translate. And so 3 years ago, I had an opportunity to partner with Groundswell for a DOE Department of Energy grant that they received around building out resilient hubs and communities. And we worked for the state of Maryland in partnership, and I was able to provide to them our community engagement strategy that helped them to really think about, going back to what we saying around, it's the networks, it's the people that are a very important part of this ecosystem's thinking around resilience. And if you don't have all of the right players at the table and decisions are being made, then who is potentially being left out of that decision making or the opportunity to benefit from that decision? And so for me, a lot of my work has entered into this resilient space from a place of helping academicians or larger nonprofits understand what this community framework really looks like. And then again, as I mentioned, I'm a member of Community Church, and so now there's a very personal space around bringing my expertise to my church, working with great partners like GIPL, like Georgia Tech SCORE, around what this means.
So we have the academic institution, and we have a interfaith-based nonprofit. Like, how did this get to happen at Georgia Tech?
So the center that I run, I opened a different iteration of 10 years ago, but it's all about, and Georgia Tech feels like an unlikely, maybe, location. Miss Alice, do you remember what she said? Who runs the Arts Exchange, an older woman who is kind of an institution in this city, helped establish the direction of the arts, right, with the city of Atlanta, I don't know what, 40 years ago, maybe? Yeah. And she said, you know, I don't remember exactly what she said, but she said something like, excuse me for what I'm about to say, but I've never liked Georgia Tech before, something blunt like that, but maybe I'm changing my mind, something blunt like that. Georgia Tech before. But it was, Georgia Tech thinks that the answer to everything is technology.
Yeah. Right.
So we're trying to, change that person by person. But the center the original purpose of the center was to integrate community partnerships around sustainability into the curriculum all across Georgia Tech. And now the purpose of the center that we run now is about integrating community partnerships around sustainability into research with faculty. So resilience, if you do sustainability and climate change work, resilience has just always been part of it, although I think the understanding of what it means, right, has changed. I think in the past there was never a focus on networks and community, and it was all about just the new technology, yeah. Which it still is. Vicars, you'll get to tell this story hopefully later, but you have the technology is important, part of that. But this particular work that we're doing now, which is really emphasizing what does it mean to put, as Dan Kilpatrick says, right, to put communities in the driver's seat. It's a problem because we should be encouraging public transit. But anyway, to put communities in the engineer's seat or whatever, and to have community-based resilience hubs as opposed to the idea really in the past, I think has been largely that government is responsible for this. So governments should set up cooling centers, right? Governments should have resilience hubs where people can come. But government, especially in under-resourced areas, often just isn't there, doesn't know it well, or can't get there in moments. Who's there? We talk a lot about people becoming their own first responders. Right. So you should talk about the wilderness training in a second. Okay. So we had some faculty, so what we do is work with faculty to help them build long-term relationships with partners and with people who work with communities, so with groups like GIPL or with people like, you're like a group, Dr. E. And we had a couple faculty in civil engineering and in earth and atmospheric sciences who were very interested in resilience. And one of them was particularly interested in, are there ways to model hurricanes that would help government and community partners be more prepared for understanding when they're gonna come and where they're gonna come and what kind of damage they're gonna do. And the other one was really interested in food distribution in times of emergency. And we just started introducing them to people we knew, and that led to a big focus on community-led resilience hubs and the idea of what does it mean to really have big institutions like Georgia Tech or the city really support community-based organizations or faith-based organizations in taking the lead and in integrating preparation and responsiveness efforts and network building efforts into what they are already doing. So like your example of the food distribution, or like what Vicars is doing. Hopefully you'll talk about, we should just give it to her to talk the whole time, but about the West Side Corridor stuff too. So yeah, of course. I just keep bringing up these examples. You probably have other ones from other churches, but these are the ones I know about.
No, Vicars is a great example, so I hope you will share more about what you all are doing there.
Well, and GIPL's been involved in the Vicars.
Yeah. But just to share a little bit about how GIPL got into this work, I think the answer really is theological, which is that we talk so much about flourishing when we talk about sustainability, and why we even exist as an organization. It's because we are working towards the flourishing of a better world, and that's what resilience is. So, we have, my organization is faith-based, and so much of what we do is bringing communities of faith along with us to understand this connection between the environment and faith traditions. And you can't do that without talking about justice and about flourishing and about how we are creating a better world than the one that we're living in right now. And that is exactly what resilience is. Again, it's about adaptation, it's about thriving, it's about moving forward in the face of challenges, both climate-related challenges and everyday challenges as well. And so, we've been doing all of this preaching about what flourishing communities looks like, and then, we have a whole slew of practical climate solution programs that we manage, and so we help congregations do energy efficiency audits, and we help them put solar on their buildings and plant trees on their properties. And I guess a couple of years ago, we really started thinking about creating a program that helps kind of combine all of these things, because it had kind of been we're preaching this, and then congregations are doing this suite of practical climate solution programs. And so then it's really been about how do we talk about this in a holistic way, where it's not just put solar on your buildings and plant some trees outside, but helping congregations think about the bigger picture, which is that the technology, which we keep saying is not important, but is part of resilience hubs and resilience. It's the solar and battery storage allows communities to keep their lights on and to open up their doors after a disaster. And the rain gardens are a climate solution where if a flooding event happens, the rain gardens are helping to keep, flooding away from the property. And the community garden and the orchard and the trees that have been planted are helping to supplement a food pantry. So it's really been about how do we make this holistic vision? It's been about creating this vision and thinking about helping faith communities think about what things they already have in place that really help to build resilience in their community, who their community is, and how they're serving the community, not just after disaster, but every day as well.
Well, and that goes to the next question I was going to ask y'all, which is what makes faith-based groups or congregations so well suited to build resilience? And while they're thinking, I will share that I think some congregations, and I know UUCA's leadership is interested in us really forging deeper relationships with community partners and local folks, not just raising funds through offerings, which has been sort of our tradition, and folks are very generous, but it doesn't really generate a lot of relationship building. And so I think there's an emphasis for us in being a bit more out there and really having some relationships out there instead of little one-off moments. And that's taking effort, and that's going to take time. But that's one of the ways we see that we can start building a community profile that's stronger than perhaps what we traditionally have done, which is to focus a little bit more interiorly at our own community life. So I hope that gave you enough time to think about that.
I mean, I can start because this is what we do. But yeah, I mean, I think a couple of reasons why faith communities are really good. It goes back to what Jenny was just saying about, historically, it's been governments or, that's who people have been looking to. And we know that the government in a lot of different ways has failed communities over the years. And so people are now looking to community groups like faith groups to respond to, the times we're in. And I think faith communities, one, have a lot of buildings and a lot of land. Here in Georgia, we have over 15,000 houses of worship across the state. We're in the Bible Belt, y'all. So this is, there's faith communities all over the place. And faith communities have the physical space and the facilities, bathrooms and large gathering spaces, and a lot of times have showers and all of the it's a gathering place for people. So the infrastructure there, at least the most of the infrastructure with some building improvements makes it a really obvious place for people to gather. But it's also the social capital. It's the community. It's the fact that there are people in the congregation that can serve as volunteers for the Resilience Hub. It's the connections that congregations already have to the community. I think, congregations are a place where people historically think to go in times of crisis. communities of faith are well equipped to provide pastoral and spiritual care in times of disaster. So there's that piece of it as well. And I think too, congregations are decentralized. So there's congregations like on every corner. It's a place where people could presumably walk if, a disaster happens and public transportation's down or roads are closed. So I think for all of those reasons, faith communities are a kind of natural place to be developing these kinds of resilience hubs.
I'll also just add that oftentimes these same churches or faith-based organizations are partnering with other faith-based organizations, and so that within itself creates a network. And I'm just thinking along community churches located in Southwest Atlanta on Cascade. There was West Hunter was recently awarded their historical site designation for Reverend Ralph David Abernathy as a historical site. But it's within a mile of community church and a mile from another church, and they were already doing things together, which brings up this West Side Resilient Corridor in terms of a partnership that's now taking place along 4 churches on Cascade with some support from Groundswell and other partners about what if all of these churches had the tech and were already connected in the way in which they are. Now you're talking about expanding the resilience of a community in a way that the burden wouldn't just fall on one church. And so in addition to what you were saying about the infrastructure tied to these congregations and faith-based organizations working together within itself will then bring together that network of the infrastructure that allows for the burden during times of crisis to be shared, which ultimately I think is one of the ways that we also find ourselves being able to be resilient, is that the burden is shared. It's not just all on one person or one individual or one congregation.
One other thing to add to all of this is that, climate change, even things like resilience, all of this has become so horribly politicized. Right. And I think faith-based organizations have a thought leadership pulpit to try to depoliticize this work. Right. And to be able also, from a faith-based perspective, to talk like the lobbying and stuff that you guys do, to be able to talk to legislators and to be able to try and move this back into a human issue and a community issue as opposed to a political issue, and especially in a place like the South where faith language is one of the strong languages that's spoken.
Thank you. I think one of the challenges perhaps of UU congregations is that often you're drawing from a distance. It's not necessarily the neighborhood church, and so that's a consideration of how does that change the role of maybe UU congregations in particular? You may not have everyone walking to your building, and that will be something we'll talk about. We talked about in advance a little bit about what is the role of your church in your community, because not all of us are the neighborhood church, and that's okay too. There are other roles that can be played without necessarily having all your neighbors know that they can just walk right on over, or so that's something to think about. I guess I'm wondering, for those of us who are new to this conversation, what do you think are some effective ways to introduce resilience into congregations and community groups? What have you seen that works?
For me, what I've seen that works is, again, that inward reflection of what's already being done as a great starting point, because it's easier to build off of programs and things that are already institutionalized to then talk about, well, what does this look like during times of crisis, or how would this support the surrounding community if you had the battery and storage technology. And again, I think what I've found is that congregations realize that they were already doing resilient work without it having the name for it. And so for me, I would say start thinking internally about what it is that you're already doing. And we'll probably talk about Why? Because those programs are the programs that will be ongoing once you have the tech during something called your Blue Sky Days, which is 90% of the times, even with the tech, you're not in disaster mode. So what are you doing during that time, even with the tech? And we call that those Blue Sky Days, but it's these programs that are already ongoing, or the opportunity to develop new programs.
So how do you think, what's effective? What do you think works to help folks start to enter into this? It's helpful to know that folks aren't starting from scratch.
They're not starting
that
from scratch.
there's an awful lot of already built and already in place. But what else do you think helps people move from maybe a comfortable place? Like you said, there's maybe some socioeconomic comfort and people assume they'll be fine. And there's ours, in our backyard, we're all good. But I wonder how you move people to start thinking outside of those areas. And we've seen, obviously, Asheville's affluent areas, LA's affluent areas, they were affected by floods and wildfires. So no one's exempt, and bad weather doesn't care. But how do you get communities to start to embrace having a role?
I mean, I think some of it depends on how does your congregation operate and what do you want to do? Because I think there's ways to both look inward and there's ways to look outward, even if you're not really a community-based church and you're drawing people from other places. So part of it is, do the people, is the interest in resilience in helping the congregants themselves, build resilient networks in the neighborhoods where they live, even if those are disparate neighborhoods, in which case there's plenty of ways to do trainings, right, that help congregants think about, what are the networks in my neighborhood? First of all, even personal resilience, if a disaster comes, am I prepared?
Right.
And are my neighbors prepared? Do I even know who my neighbors are? We live in a world today where a lot of people don't know their neighbors the same way that they did in the past. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes you don't want to know your neighbors. But in a disaster, it's not very helpful, even if you don't like them very much. But there are ways to think about how you help, say, your congregants build their own neighborhood networks in cases to be more resilient as a block or as a development or as a neighborhood. So there could be that kind of training going on. Or think about, how do I map my neighborhood and understand the organizations in my own neighborhood that might be resilience hubs or be able to be resilience hubs, and to give people training into how to work with their neighborhood or the places that are close to them. So that's one thing if the goal was to kind of help people build up their own resilience networks. Another thing I think is to operate more like we operate at Georgia Tech. We don't have an obvious, the work we're doing isn't about building a resilient Midtown or building a resilient Tech Square or whatever. There are other people at Tech that do can our big green buildings serve as resilience hubs that are thinking about that. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're doing is saying, well, we have researchers, we have students, we have money, right? We have different resources. How do we garner those resources to, say, help Vicars in the West Side Corridor, or bring together GIPL and some other people, which we've done, to do some pilot projects and then try to get more funding. So that's another thing that a congregation can do, right, is say, like you mentioned earlier, that you have, you helped seed another congregation on the west side.
Abundant Love.
Yeah. So, I mean, what's happening, where is that, and what's happening there, and do they need more help if they are a community-based congregation, or even not congregations? Are there ways to, are there congregants who have connections or in their lives with organizations that they think that are trying to be resilience hubs, or might like to be, and are there ways then for your congregation to support that work in different ways?
I feel like I just want to reinforce everything that both of you said, because I think the starting step that I would recommend is holding community engagement sessions, both internally and externally. So have a community engagement session with members of your congregation and do some of that asset mapping of like, what are the skills and resources that we have within this congregation, and how can we use those skills and resources to like build up a resilience network? And so that might look like saying, we have people with money, we have a lot of retired folks who have time on their hands. We have people with like some hard skills, like some folks that are like retired from like construction or like know how to do construction things. And so like, what can we do with that? And I want to use UUCA, I think, as an example here of, we've been in conversation with Jon and some other folks here at this congregation about resilience hubs, and one of the ideas that has come out of that is that they might host a disaster trailer. So that, we could explore funding to get a trailer that is deployed to communities after disaster strikes, because they have volunteers in the congregation who could haul the trailer. They have folks who like have experience with like chainsaws that want to go and cut up trees after like they've fallen down, and people who maybe will help cook, if we have like a little kitchen in the trailer, who will help cook meals. And so, part of that has come about because of the recognition of like the skills that exist in this congregation. So, that's just one example of like what can come out of these like internal discernment sessions in the congregation of like, what really assets do we have, and what is the best way that we can like serve our community or state. And then the external community engagement session, I think, that's part 2, which is also listening to the community, getting to know the community. And this goes back to what Jon was saying of like, not every church is really community-based. A lot of congregations have their members live all over the city. And so it's getting the community together to see what does the community need, and is the church a place where the community thinks to go in times of a disaster. I met with a church down the street from here a couple months ago, because they were like, we hear you talking about resilience hubs, we want to be a resilience hub, like what could that look like? And so I started asking them questions of like, do members of your congregation live in this neighborhood, or like who would the resilience hub serve after a disaster? And they were like, a lot of our members live even 10, 15 miles away. And I was like, okay, so like, how do you engage the community? Do people in the community think to come here? Like, where would they go if, the power went out? And they were like, honestly, people would go to Walmart down the street. And I was like, okay, well, let's talk about that. Like, not to say that you couldn't be the place where people go, but kind of to what Jenny was saying, like maybe there's another way that the church can serve the community, or what you need to start to do is like have a food pantry or soup kitchen, or like starting with like programs and services that are drawing the community in so that the community thinks to come here if a disaster happens. And so, or maybe the answer is like, this is not the right place for a resilience hub because it is not community-based, but a mile down the street is another church that is much more community-based. So maybe the point is to spend the resources and send volunteers from this congregation down there to really help build out their resilience hub. So yeah, I think it's doing that like community engagement and discernment, and spending some time thinking about like, are we just going in telling the community what they need, or are we really listening to the community and hearing what the community wants and needs, and how are we responding in that way?
And I'll just add, though, if you determine that your church isn't necessarily the best place for the resilient hub, that doesn't mean you don't have a role in the resilient network. Going back to how can you support this network that would ultimately strengthen the resilience of the community.
That can include Walmart.
That can,
Yes.
most definitely can include Walmart.
Yeah.
And
Walmart has a lot of assets.
a lot of assets.
For resilience.
But this is where even some of the dialogue that may have started internally, and noticing that folks go to Walmart, well, now what does it look like to go to that local Walmart, or have those conversations about these other private or public facilities like schools, be part of the conversation in your community around they being better suited, but again, thinking about the network as a whole, thinking about these things holistically.
And maybe, maybe just to give one more example of this, there maybe a year ago or so, there was a hurricane on the coast that caused a lot of flooding in the Richmond Hill neighborhood where one of my colleagues lives. And there was a church that opened up its doors as a distribution center because they already had the infrastructure there, a food and resource distribution center. Well, then that church flooded. So then another church was okay, well, we don't really have this infrastructure, but we're not flooded, so bring everything over here. And then members from another church were okay, well, we have kayaks and boats, and people were literally boating supplies to neighbors. And so that's another example of the one church that was kind of the resilience hub, then they got flooded. So then other churches were okay, great. Well, we're not a resilience hub, but we're connected. Again, it goes back to this social cohesion and networks of just because a church is not a resilience hub doesn't mean that it can't be involved. Members of those congregations were oh, here's what we have. And it really took the whole community to respond to that event.
Yeah, I was also just going to say, I think we can't forget about disasters that don't inhibit communication and transportation. So the big disaster in Chicago in the 90s was a heat wave. You could go anywhere you needed to go. And the phones worked, the internet worked. It was just really freaking hot out. And 700 something people died. And so there's a really interesting study that I talk about ad nauseum by a sociologist named, don't you? You've heard this story many times.
Yes, I've heard this story.
A sociologist named Eric Kleinenberg, who studied two neighborhoods in Chicago that are contiguous. And one is really, and they're both very low income, and they're both 99% African American. And one of them had the highest mortality rate from the heat wave, and one of them had the lowest mortality rate. So why do you guess why that is? Resilience hubs. No, I wish that were the answer. This was in the 90s. Nobody was talking about resilience hubs. What else do you think it was? Yeah. Nope. What did you say? Yep. They checked on their neighbors. So if a person is old or disabled or can't get or not very mobile or whatever, and they don't have air conditioning or it stops working or whatever, and no one checks on them, they die. It doesn't matter if there's 1 million cooling centers. If no one checks on them and they can't get there, they die, right? And so, yes.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah. A phone tree. And so part of the question is, too, if you're thinking internally, it really doesn't matter if you live 15 miles away. If someone calls you, and they could come get you. I mean, the roads are fine in a heat wave, usually. Right. So there are disasters, too, or tornadoes. Tornadoes are extremely targeted. There's a tornado here, and everything here is totally fine, right? So there are disasters where just even if you're disparate or decentralized, or if you know people you can call who live closer, things like that.
Yeah, this brings me to think about COVID. When COVID hit, Atlanta is broken up into neighborhood planning units. Community Church is part of one of the smaller neighborhood planning units for the city of Atlanta, MPUS. And when COVID hit, and while the government was still both federal, state, and local figuring what to do, not only within our MPUS, but I think across Metro Atlanta, we saw community step in. We saw community develop mutual aid centers, community be the ones to create these phone trees. And I'm thinking specifically within our MPUS, we have the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance is one of the neighborhoods based organizations. And we began calling our seniors, making sure that they had food. Community Church feeds over 300 families weekly, so we were able to distribute food to the most vulnerable of our communities. And post-COVID, we've kept up with that phone tree, keeping it updated, making sure that not only in the times of disasters, but what we learned was sometimes most of our seniors didn't have family and they were really glad that somebody called to just check in. So some of that emotional support. And so I know that we all remember COVID and think about the ways in which you or your congregation stepped in while the government was thinking and getting it together is a great example of not a physical disaster per se, but still yet a disaster.
I think one of the things we've noticed here, and I imagine other communities have found, is that when you have had an opportunity to respond, whether it's a supply drive, an emergency supply drive, or something else, it does tap a spirit in your congregation that feels really edifying, and that folks choose. We rise to the occasion. Right. Oftentimes, it's one of the more solidarity-building events. So I think a number of congregations are looking for these opportunities and maybe are just sort of settling into patterns of comfortable ways instead of pushing to the place where those kind of opportunities are actually more prevalent, not necessarily in a moment of extraordinary disaster. Yeah. And that, and I think that's something we're all probably doing some soul searching on, of how we are making those opportunities known. So I know that we're going to share a resource list with you in a little bit. So I'm not going to ask a question about resources because y'all have shared some of the ones you think are very valuable. So we want you to know that's coming. But now that you have heard some of an expanded definition, perhaps things you were not thinking when we did the word cloud, I'm wondering if we can start to kind of settle out some baby steps, some sort of big kid steps, and maybe some dream steps. And maybe we can move away from keeping on using Resilience Hub, because maybe we're narrow on that, and we need to just think about resilience helpers or resilience networkers, so that we're not continually thinking about a facility-based mindset, which might be very limiting and inappropriate for some of our places. But if you could maybe help us think, when we leave here, what are the baby steps? What's a really good start? What would be a little more down the road, and then what would just be idealistic?
Well, I think you started and gave a great kind of first step in terms of internally this community engagement process and asset mapping that happens internally, and then doing that externally as well as a first step to just listen to the members within your community, learning what your assets are within your own congregation, and then opening that conversation up further, I think is a great first step that you already highlighted as a first initial baby step. My grandmother says you can't do what you don't know, all right? And having these engagement sessions become a great way of learning.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was going to say as well. But I think another piece is like organizing a team who's going to work on this. We at Gipple, like our first step when we work with any congregation is to tell them to form a green team. And we say 3 people, that's all you need for a green team. And 3 is even kind of an arbitrary number, but like it feels like at least 3 is like kind of a critical mass of people. But I think like that's so important for any community that like wants to work on something. And if we're thinking congregation, which, I'll try not to like talk about facility stuff, but like in a congregation, you don't want the pastor or the staff to be like, they're pulled in so many different directions. And so like having some lay leadership, some folks in the congregation that are really excited about this, like if you're a pastor, find out who those people are. If you are a member of a congregation, like call some friends who you think might be interested in this, and like form a team that's going to help lead some of these things. You need somebody who's going to like take the initiative to say, we should have a community engagement session. We should have an educational panel where we're talking about this. So that's kind of my baby step, even maybe before we do the community engagement stuff, is like figure out who's going to lead this work. Get a couple of friends and say, we're going to take the initiative for a year to explore this.
Another thing you can do if you want to do it less formally, and I think Gipple, you guys are the experts on helping faith-based groups do this, but is if one person has an idea and can get a couple other people excited about it, you can just start it. Yeah. Like if there is somebody, if I'm Jewish, but if I were active in a temple, I could imagine saying to a couple people, like, I want to support the work that's happening in Vicars and the West Side Corridor. If there were a couple other people who thought that was cool, then we could just do it through the temple. And, and you wouldn't have to necessarily have a huge planning session. It could just start if there is somebody with a project that they're already working on and they want the congregation to support. And then you might end up doing more of a community conversation down the line. But if there is an obvious starting point, I would also say the baby step can be just go with that.
This past week, UUA started I don't know what the right term for it is, but we're a resilience hub conversation group. There's a special term for it. We're just calling it Hubs of Resilience. And an Ann Arbor group is a part of this, and they were saying that really what helped them organize was that as a church, they came up with 3 priorities that every group was going to hold themselves to. And one of those was radical welcome, right? But one of those was resilience. And so in congregations where we kind of get siloed into our particular aims and our affinity groups, sometimes trying to not break those apart because they serve such valuable functions, but to see if you could expand some of the potential for collaboration, which will take some culture shifts and some communication efforts, is something that church, Ann Arbor, this congregation in Ann Arbor, was really succeeding. And they said the city of Ann Arbor was in a place of really developing easier communication and collaboration as a city. And that, I had no idea. It was a really impressive model for me. So they've obviously gone beyond the baby steps up there. Any other thoughts on maybe, if everyone was in the know, if everyone already had beyond 101 and 201 resilience courses, we were all in the 301 or senior seminar, what would you say would be if you were moving in that area, in that particular direction, you'd be solving some things?
That's hard. I don't feel like I'm in that. I don't feel like I'm in the senior seminar.
So I'm going to speak for community church. The tech happened before some of the internal cohesion needed to happen. And we're grateful that GIPO came. But to me, some things to be thinking about once you've made the decision that you're ready. Before the tech, think about how you're going to operate. What does that operate? I can't say it. Thank you. What does it really, really look like? Because it's going to be greater than just the 3 members. Case in point, we've had a few winter issues this past winter, and it brought up some real kind of things in terms of, well, if we are going to open in partnership with the city as a heating center, do we stay overnight? Oh, that brings up a whole nother, who's staying overnight? What does the security look like? Do you want to have just people there without police presence, or, just all of that? And so once a decision has been made, I think, and I would say this as lessons learned, we should have probably had an opportunity to have those conversations before the tech actually came as well. And so I would say once a decision has been made, start thinking about what does it look like to operate in a disaster, and what are the various components then that are needed that may be present or may need to be built out as the next step.
I think 2 things that come to my mind that one that kind of builds off of this is do the broader partnership mapping and networking and building those partnerships, because I think I think maybe this gets to the next question, so I will try not to steal your thunder in asking it. But there's so many, in in most places, there's so many different groups that are working on this, and so like knowing who's working on it and bringing some of those folks together. One of the groups that Gippel's part of is City of Decatur Resilience Planning, and so that involves like the local fire department and police officers and Agnes Scott College and Georgia Interfaith Power and Light and some other nonprofits, and so like building kind of some of those partnerships and knowing who in the community is working on some of this, and local emergency management agencies, like knowing, that's part of it, is like knowing who the groups are and getting connected. And that's kind of a broader like resilience strategy. That's not just resilience hub strategy, like knowing who's working on similar issues. And then the other thing that we haven't really talked a lot about, but is like climate disaster mapping. There's a lot of tools out there to know what climate risks your community are most vulnerable for. Like, are you in a flood basin? Are you likely to flood? What are the climate risks associated with your area? I would say that's kind of another kid step, and not to like create fear in your community, but to know, what are the risks, and that's going to determine what physical infrastructure you need to put into place. And so that's kind of the other thing that comes to my mind that we haven't really talked about.
Yeah, this is going back a little. This might not be the senior seminar, but how many of your congregations do like book clubs? It's like a common thing, right? So the other thing is just to do some reading or watch some movies, or, read Eric Kleinenberg's book. It's called Heat Wave. And just do some learning. Like, you'll see some resources that we've shared, including some that are about the Vicars' work, articles and stuff like that, but bring in a speaker or two. I think all of you got the flyer that I brought about April 15th. We have a speaker coming from Drexel in Philadelphia, and then a panel that Dr. E is actually going to be leading with a bunch, send someone to that if you're in the Atlanta area, and just start learning.
I think that's like a great baby step. Like, yeah, you don't know what you don't know, so.
And I also say most of the counties or local government within Metro Atlanta are having these conversations internally, and that would also be a great place and resource to start reaching out and tapping into to figure out, hey, does my county or city have a resilience plan? Are they having those conversations? Because they're definitely having them in the city of Atlanta. And when we say the city of Atlanta, people think, oh, Atlanta's so big. No, it's really only 13 miles proper in terms of the city of Atlanta. But even our regional planning district are having these conversations as well. And so I think often in and moments, and this is an and moment, it's not an either or, it's not a just us and them, it's and how do we work together in terms of the resources then that are able to flow from the federal, state, and local municipalities as well.
I'm thinking that oftentimes, you mentioned, we expect government to be prepared. We want FEMA to respond. We wanted FEMA to be able to respond.
Right.
Red Cross, obviously, and we have members in our church and others who are Red Cross, disaster responders and things like that. And a number of places, I imagine some of you are priority thinking, how would we make space for this? We're so maxed. We've got so many initiatives. We're really spread thin, and it's the 80-20, and 20% are doing 80% of the volunteer work. How do we, all of those dynamics are in play, right? And we can all say, yes, this is at play. Then how do you start getting your leadership or some of your more influential members to move the conversation to having this be a priority? I will tell you that I think a couple of years ago, a very close friend of mine was sharing some of her concerns as we were thinking about collapse and the polycrisis, which is its whole area of study and reading. And sometimes I would walk away from our conversations thinking, you're a prepper. And I had disdain for that. You're a prepper. And I was like, that's all about either conspiracy or just anxiety or all that. And I now am starting to see not necessarily my bunker with 40 days of food, But I am starting to see that there is a preparedness that sure will put us in a position to serve in a critical way. And that's sort of what we're pushing here. We don't want to get caught on our heels when we could have done something on those blue sky days. So I know that y'all have questions, and I want to leave us opportunity to ask those. What we're going to do, though, because there will probably be a breadth of questions, is really think about formulating your question as a question and try to minimize some of the background that you may think we need. We probably won't. Just give us the question. And I'm going to ask the panel, for the interest of getting to as many questions as we can before our time is up, to really kind of give that good concentrated response. Is that fair? Yeah. So I open it up. What do you want to know? Tell me.
I have a question. How do you keep your resilient hubs for the long term? Because a lot of times it's just, here's a crisis, action, and then people still need help.
So the question, as I understand it, is how do you create a resilience hub that has lasting power and doesn't simply arise and perhaps fade after a particular crisis moment?
I mean, I think that goes back to building off of existing ministries and infrastructures. And so not developing something new that is in response to a crisis, but thinking about what are the year-round programs that will support the community that also would help after a disaster crisis. So like your I keep going back to food pantries, but like I think that's a really good example of like the kind of thing that you would have year-round that you find volunteers, make it sustainable, and then that also helps right after a crisis. Or like having regular programming. One of the things that GIPL encourages is have congregations hosting webinars or educational opportunities around things like disaster preparedness at home, insurance, like flood things, getting people in the community really like prepared for if a disaster happens. But those educational workshops can happen on Wednesday nights throughout the year, and then people are better prepared when a disaster happens. But having like a regular calendar programming is something else that people can do that's like a sustainable thing that just happens, but that also helps to make the community stronger after disaster.
One more thing I would add is just to learn and change. So if you have a food pantry and you think you're all set up for a disaster happens, you put your plan into action, there's going to be things that you learn from that. So you have to do reflection and improvement. So like the way your food pantry is set up, in theory, I think should look different after you have used it as a distribution channel during a disaster, and then it keeps getting more and more better. It keeps getting in better and better shape to deal with future disasters because you do that reflection and adjustment every time.
When we think about Georgia's emergencies, a lot of us think about the coast. And GIPL has a staff person who is a part of the resilience leadership who is now stationed on the coast. Within the last year and a half or so. So that's their commitment in saying, we know that's where stuff's gonna happen. A lot of stuff's gonna happen there. Atlanta is pretty lucky that we don't see a lot of things, do we?
I would disagree.
Good, please tell me.
And I would say now just extreme weather events. So not just hurricanes, but here in Atlanta, we now get a lot of rain in a short amount of time that overfloods our outdated sewer systems. So as development is happening, and a lot of this development isn't happening in a way that encourages green infrastructure, permeable pavers and things, a lot more concrete is being laid that's changing the water patterns. And so areas that used to flood, or rather that didn't flood, are now flooding during these events. We've even seen here within the state changes in tornado patterns. Born and raised here in Georgia, when I was a little girl, we used to have tornado drills. I don't even think they do tornado drills anymore, but that's they still do? Okay, well, that's good to know. But we've seen tornadoes drop in places, especially in the city of Atlanta, that would not have been thought of. And so I think too, expanding our understanding of extreme weather events, not just being hurricanes, like the heat waves.
Question in the back.
Yeah, so Jennifer Hirsch, when you were mentioning the heat wave book, it brought up something which is tying in with what you're speaking to, and that is air quality along with heat. So I attended some of the Georgia Public Service Commission hearings, and what made the biggest impact was emergency room physicians who stood up, especially from Grady, and said they're seeing deaths of vulnerable elderly and children on the hottest days of the summer, because if you do mapping, and I'm sure Georgia Tech has this capacity, you can see the air pollution indices in particular parts of the city of Atlanta are skyrocketing.
Did-
So as we have heat and that kind of.
Did you have a question for the panel?
I apologize.
That's okay.
My question, but
It's helpful. No, it's helpful. And it definitely highlights to me that every time I hear from these folks and read other things, it helps complexify. But instead of getting intimidated by that, I'm like, where's my curiosity drawn? Like, where can I kind of dig in a little bit on this? And so you're helping kind of expand again.
Well, and just to add, our local experts, who are our local experts?
Right.
We do have ER doctors who are volunteering their time, their busy
Right.
time to stand up and sound the alarm.
Thank you for that.
So two things about that. I think it's a really important comment because my much earlier comment about who do we consider most resilient. I mean, we think about resilience in terms of, emergency events, but we have resilience on a daily basis, especially in communities that have been the least served and the most discriminated against. And so another book I'll recommend is called Race and the Greening of Atlanta. Do you know that book? Christopher Sellers. And one of the things that he talks about is, after Reconstruction, after slavery, after Reconstruction, Atlanta was basically, the way that Atlanta was set up was similar, not to the north in the United States, but to countries that we considered to be third world in terms of the segregation and the infrastructure in the segregated neighborhoods, the black segregated neighborhoods, right? That the best comparison was to cities, big cities in the third world. And so we now live the legacy of that, which is one of the reasons that makes Atlanta still so vulnerable to extreme weather or the stuff you're talking about on a daily basis, is because of the history of discrimination and discriminatory planning practices that continue today. And so there are efforts that also you can find if you want as a congregation to think about what efforts can we support. And these would be resilience-related efforts like urban heat. There's a program called Urban Heat ATL. It's kind of getting up and running again, right? I mean, it had a lull and then it's up. They'll find it online?
Yes.
Urban Heat ATL, which is citizen science of understanding what is happening in terms of heat and the impact that it's having. And it's been run in part by West Atlanta Watershed Alliance and under the kind of leadership of the person who started West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, Dr. Nataki Osborne-Jelks, who is now faculty at Spelman College. But there are things like that you can also look to support that are not about the emergencies. They are about daily life and the impact of climate change on daily life.
So I know for those of you who are not Atlanta-based, we keep referring to Atlanta because we are all Atlanta-based. So forgive us for that. We know we have all of you from all over the Southeast, and we appreciate you indulging our Atlanta references.
And you can look for similar
But you will find, hopefully this will help you at least steer in the right direction where you're coming from. Another question? Yes.
We spoke to the human aspect when we were going over the word while. What's something unique that you all learned from marginalized communities and what they're doing for community resilience?
The question is, what would you say is a takeaway that you've learned from marginalized communities in terms of how they have addressed or have influenced the conversation around resilience? Did I capture that okay?
For me, it's you can't wait for others outside of the community or yourselves to come in. What can we do internally? And the closest thing that comes to mind again is COVID and how mutual aid centers throughout Metro Atlanta were birthed that are still ongoing now because they saw that it was a need and a continued need to then support these marginalized communities. And so kind of supporting the power within that I think shifted a lot of the thinking in terms of even though these communities are marginalized, they have a lot of assets that can support and be built upon prior to a disaster.
I was going to say something similar. I think marginalized communities are really strong in social cohesion and networks. And we do a lot of work in rural Georgia, and so thinking about some lessons learned from like a rural part community in the state that is under-resourced, low income, and does not have all of the things that Atlanta has, like resource-wise and funding-wise. What we've learned from working with those communities is like, those are the communities, like everybody knows their neighbor. Right. That's where the phone trees exist, like, and have, and still do. And like, that is such an important, I mean, we've talked about it, so I won't expand on it too much, but like, that's such an important part of this resilience stuff. And I think that's like my biggest takeaway from marginalized communities is like, that social network is very much alive and there, and everybody has each other's numbers and is already looking out for each other. And that should be part of what all of our communities are doing.
Excellent. Another question, please.
So I lived in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands for a while, and after the 1989 Hurricane Hugo that just devastated the island, the faith communities got together and formed VOAD, Volunteers Organized Against Disaster. And I vaguely recall that there was some link to organizations stateside. Are y'all familiar with anything like this? And this was interfaith. They would have trainings. We had a coordinator that kept us on our toes fairly. So
the question in reference.
I'm curious if there's a.
Yeah, VOAD is a thing.
It is a
and Hannah
thing.
can tell you about it.
Yeah.
Still a thing. Yep.
Do you know much about it? Okay, I know that it exists. My colleague Beth has looked into it. We might be a member of the Georgia VOAD, to be honest with you. I know that it exists, and we have, if we're not a member, we have looked into, do we join it? Because my understanding is that it involves emergency management agencies. It involves a lot of groups like United Methodist Disaster Response, Presbyterian Disaster Response, and so we have looked into that as like a main source of partnership. So I'm vaguely familiar.
Because the one thing I wasn't hearing, I was hearing you all talking about these resilience hubs in faith community, but what they did in St. Croix is the faith community formed a coalition.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't just the individual faith communities or denominations, but they coalesced.
I think that goes back to, John had asked, like, kid step, baby step, and then like dream step. That's kind of like the dream step that we didn't really get to, but I think that that's a perfect example
I would encourage all of you to look
that.
up VOAD, or Georgia VOAD, because I've looked at their website, and the goal is to bring others into partnerships so that you are ready to be deployed in effective, timely ways by some of the powers that be that do this on a daily basis, to bring in those resources that are faith-based and other sort of community groups. That's sort of the goal of the VOAD, as I understand it. So I'm glad it still exists.
Resource list?
I'll try to add it, yeah? Yeah, I'll be glad to. But if you just look, literally, if you looked up Georgia VOAD, VOAD, you're gonna find that. We have time for one more question. Please, yes.
Comment about prepper, I was going to mention at some point, because I consolidated FEMA and GEMA recommendations for disaster preparation, because it's 25, 30 pages, maybe 2 pages of a canvas of it.
Wow.
And talking to people in the community, part of our goal is to build communities around us. Generally, people have no interest, and if one guy shows you, oh, you're a prepper. Yeah, I'm a prepper, but I'm a community prepper.
Right.
So who are our medical people, who are this, who have the research? And a lot of people don't have time to go through any official training, they don't want to hear that, they're too busy. So I'm start with that just simple. So when you brought all that up,
Well, I'm glad to hear you sort of say, yeah, that whole prepper thing can be a problem, but I tell you who I want to be with in an emergency.
Oh, I was going to say, it sounds like you have some resources that could be shared back.
We
I
would
love
to
your
have
two-pager.
Yeah.
Right.
We want your two-pager on our resource list.
Started for me, just quick, okay, I have a grandson who went to the University of Georgia, and he's in school business there. He and a professor wrote a paper about, and please bear with me because this is not conspiracy theory, this is fact. All these modern appliances have capabilities of Wi-Fi communication across the globe. And they did a paper and actually presented it in Scotland. It's part of what he did. And it's telling people these are the facts. Your appliances are accessible to people who want to do damage. And at any moment, and this was the warning, this is 3 or 4 years ago, you could lose your water supply and your power supply. And so what would you do if you have no water and you have no power? And or phone, but
Yeah.
so that's what's triggered that.
Yeah, so you're not just talking about climate, you're talking about other things that will create disruption, and that disruption could be long-lasting. So I think ultimately it's not hard now to get people to recognize, even without the depth of that specific example, that there are contingencies to be prepared for.
Right.
And there are some we can't imagine, so we want to have a base level of preparedness to make sure that we're not feeling, as we used to use the acronym SOUL, in the moment, when the moment comes, because then we're going to have all kind of emotional needs that go with the other, base needs. So I think that's what this conversation is starting. I want to thank y'all for being here. I hope that Soul Summit has pretty big aspirations, and we are taking on some hard times. That's what the point of the theme of this particular Soul Summit is. And this is a very practical place to be, where others are dealing with some of the other things. Please, let's make sure that we're taking from this. The conversation continues, it grows. You're drawing more people in. You're not giving in to your own paralysis around fear and anxiety that's rampant, and that I'm hearing in conversations around with others in this congregation, and that in some ways being proactive and giving that spirit of we want to serve and help our communities is something that hopefully will generate the right kind of motivation. And we can really tap that to feel the joy and to feel the hopefulness and to feel the solidarity that I think a lot of us are longing for in a time of hyper-individualism, but also recognizing that few of us are self-sufficient. Interdependence is a UU value, and we really are trying to live into it. Thank you so much. Please give them a round of applause.